Hey everybody, welcome back. Today, instead of writing, I'm going to sit down with historical fantasy author Maria Grace. Now, Maria Grace is an amazing author. She's got a ton of books out there. She's most well known for her Jane Austen's Dragons series, but we're going to sit down and talk about the Gaslamp genre. We're going to talk about fantasy writing generally, and we have several books from her bookshelf that she considers a must read if you are going to get into the genre of Gaslamp fantasy. So let's go into it. So I'm very pleased to welcome Maria Grace to Instead of Writing. She's a six-time Bragg Medallion honoree, a #1 best-selling historical fantasy author. She's got a PhD in educational psychology. She's been a professor in the classroom for like 16 years. And her qualifications just go on and on and on. But welcome, Maria Grace. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Uh,
The
well,
most difficult question of all.
it really is. It really is. Um, well, believe it or not, I'm a grandmother of five.
Oh, congratulations. That's
Thank you. And on our most recent vacation, we went caving in the San Antonio area on a wild cave tour in Natural Bridge Caverns, which required helmets and headlamps.
oh, cool.
And we were literally belly crawling underground. The space was 22 inches in diameter,
That is so
which is
little.
exactly what you expect grandmothers to be doing every day, right?
No, not at all. You've just described one of my greatest fears, I think, is to get stuck in one of those spots and like can't do it. Can't do it.
Actually, my husband and my son almost did in one of the caves in Indiana that we went through. The space was so tight, they literally had to hold their breath getting through, and had
Oh my
informed
gosh.
me after this, we are never doing that again. So I swear I interviewed the cave guide before booking this tour and made sure what the dimensions were and checked everybody to make sure they wouldn't get stuck.
You're measuring your family like a lot of people measure their ride, like kids before Disneyland or something, to make sure they could go on the rides. That is
Must be smaller
amazing.
than this not to get stuck.
Have like a bucket. This is the test bucket to make sure you can go on vacation. That's crazy. Well, so you are I mean, prolific is the word that comes to mind. It seems like you have so many books out, and they're all really cool. I mean, the most eye-catching, I guess, for lack of a better word, your Jane Austen and Dragons series, which is what? How many books is in that now? Eight,
I
nine?
am working on number 11 right now.
My
And then
word!
there's one adjacent book that's kind of setting out. So I guess maybe it's 12.
Wow,
It's
that's
a
so
lot.
fun.
We've got it's 850,000 words in the series so far.
How does that feel to know that, like most people, I mean, that's like a very high end house purchase. You know what I mean? 850,000 is like, whoa. I guess I say that nowadays it's like a entry level house purchase. It feels like
It
with
really
them.
seems that way, doesn't it?
But yeah. So what has that been like for you to build out this latest series?
It's been a little mind blowing because I got this idea on a whim. What happened? I've got three sons who are now between 23 and 31. I
Okay.
obviously have grandchildren, but at the time they were all in high school, and teenage boys like to eat. So I took them out. We regularly would go to the local pizza buffet and just talk,
Oh,
toss out
cool.
ideas and do that sort of thing. So we're just chatting and eating lots of pizza. And what if there were dragons in Jane Austen's England? Which, normally most normal people would say, oh, that's interesting, and move on.
Right.
And no, I kind of looked at them and said, how would that work? So we spent like the next hour eating more pizza than we should have, talking about how this concept could possibly work. And I thought, this is just way too much fun. Let me try. I couldn't get the idea out of my head. So it's like, well, let's give it a try. And I honestly thought it was going to be a 3-book endeavor, because most of my series are in the 3-book, 4-book range. So I
Sure.
thought it was going to be 3 books, and it was going to mirror the arc of Pride and Prejudice. Well, I couldn't stop. And I just, the characters just took off and the world became so engaging that we kept generating new ideas. And then one day, my husband and I were out walking, and my favorite Jane Austen is Persuasion. And he looked at me and he said, well, what if Lady Russell was a dragon? And, you know, 2 more books came out of that.
Amazing.
But it's just such a fun world. And what I love right now is I had a comment on my Facebook group just this week of a lady who gave the books to her son, who was, you know, doing Pride and Prejudice in high school. And he said, it's a whole lot more interesting with dragons. And the
You
book that
could
he read in
probably
high
say that
school,
about a lot of things, right? This would be so much more interesting. I mean, the
what is
NBA
it more interesting with
finals, yeah,
dragons?
anything, yeah. I'm thinking MasterChef, like anything. You just choose something. That's
That'd be
great.
great.
Yeah, it's like a family endeavor. So this book series has been.
Yeah, and I've had a lot of people tell me that after they finish the books, they give it to their young adult children. You know, the
Oh,
kids who
cool.
read. It's not a young adult series, but it's engaging enough that I have a lot of people reading it with their kids and their families,
It's like
which
young
I think it's just
adult
fantastic.
friendly.
It
Yeah.
is. It is. There's just something really enticing about this hidden world kind of genre. Like in Harry Potter, there was this underlying hidden world of magic that normal people didn't have access to, but was going on at the same time. And this is similar because the dragons are only identifiable by people with a particular genetic trait, which allows them to hear their voices.
Oh, cool.
And so it's a hidden in plain sight kind of thing that I think everybody just finds that really intriguing, of what's out there that I'm not seeing.
Right. It almost like then you can read Jane Austen and if if you hear the voice, you get
Yes.
to see beyond just the regular text of Jane Austen.
Mhm.
Very cool.
Exactly.
Yeah, so if somebody wants to get into that series, I mean, which is the
Mhm.
book they should start with?
Well, that's one of the fun things. There's really 4 or 5 entry points you can jump into the series with. I
Oh, great.
have a free book on Amazon called The Buttercross Dragon,
Okay.
which is an introduction to the world just in general. It's a side story, but it's so much fun.
Oh,
It's just
cool.
really fun. So that's one place. The Pride and Prejudice arc begins with Pemberley, Mr. Darcy's Dragon.
Okay.
And that's a place to start. There's also a prequel to that called A Proper Introduction to Dragons
Okay.
that you could start. Then the Persuasion arc has Killinch Dragon Persuasion, which is a place to start, or The Dragons of Killinch, which is the prequel book.
Oh, cool.
Which, I think it's kind of fun that there are lots of places you can jump in, and the series will still make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I like that. I like it when you see like 10-book series or 11-book series, like you're saying, it can feel so intimidating. So to know that you don't have to be 8 books deep to understand book 9, so to speak. That's great.
Right.
That's great. Yeah, and we'll have a link for that for all of you in the description of the video, so you can get started with Buttercross Dragon. So you mentioned that young adult friendly is maybe a good word. I think a lot of young adults they read Jane Austen in those teenage years sometimes, and so that might be a great segue to talk about why Regency era, why Jane Austen. What is it about the history side of things that really kind of tickles you?
Honestly, I think it's because I don't think I understand the modern world well enough to write in it.
Kindred spirit. I love that answer. There's so much out there right now. It's just so confusing.
And I feel like every time I turn around, there's one more thing that I should have known, but I didn't. And sometimes I just feel like, not sure I fit, but I think a lot of us kind of have that feeling.
Yeah, I think when I was growing up as a teenager, it felt like, man, I feel like even my visual look would have been amazing this time period. You know what I mean? Or like, for whatever reason, I should have been in the 1940s or whatever. And I think a lot of people share that feeling of they kind of have an era of time they just feel connected to for whatever reason. Would you say for you that's like the Regency era?
Um, I think to a certain degree. I mean, I certainly, if you ask me if I'd like to go live in that era, the answer is a resounding no. And the
You
reason
sure?
would be lack of antibiotics.
Yeah,
Um, I mean, because that was really, really a brutal time. And for a woman, childbirth killed 1 in 12.
it's incredible to see those mortality rates back then.
Yeah, so it's like, no, I really would not have actually wanted to live then.
Yeah, absolutely.
But as a time period, it was absolutely fascinating because it's a time of real social upheaval and transition as we're moving off of the Enlightenment, which totally changed the way people were thinking about society and government and science. So there's this intellectual upheaval. We're on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution.
Hmm.
We've just finished the Napoleonic Wars. So there's a tremendous amount that's in transition. But at the same time, it's not so far away from us that we have a hard time, at least for me, getting into it and understanding things. Like
Sure.
way back in the day, the Earth's Children series, Clan of the Cave Bear by Jean Ault, which was an amazing series. I mean, each book was about that fat.
Yeah.
And so much research went into it to trying to bring it to life. And she did a fantastic job. But as a reader, it's a tremendous amount of work to try to bridge into that world.
Yeah.
Because it's so incredibly different. And I think that's one challenge for any writer of any form of speculative fiction, is to make the world accessible.
Yeah.
And there are times where I am exhausted and I want to read to escape, but I'm so tired that I need something with world building that I can jump into without feeling like I'm studying for an exam and trying to remember all the details.
That's a great way to put it.
And you've read some of the worlds that are just so involved, and they're wonderful when you have all your brain cells operating.
Yeah, and like when you finally dive in and understand it and appreciate all the nuance, you're like, this is amazing. But until you can get there, it does feel like kind of a slog. Yeah.
And because I like to read to escape, I want to create that same kind of world where, I have people who will reread the series each time a new book comes out.
Mm-hmm.
And I get comments on Facebook, oh, I just noticed this.
Oh, cool.
That's, layers of nuances. And I wish I could take credit for being brilliant in foreshadowing things from later books, but it's just entirely dumb luck and subconscious, things working.
Don't sell yourself short. Your subconscious is working very hard and you just sold it out. You threw it under the bus. Oh, I love that. A lot of your books are listed under the Gaslamp fantasy genre.
Mm-hmm.
That, for a lot of the reasons you just said, that's a genre that I love to write in. Partly because, it's like a time of transition and intersection. And so it's like, the Industrial Revolutions come in. We're dealing with a clash of science and kind of this belief in the supernatural, and people are trying to grapple with that. How would you define Gaslamp fantasy, even in terms of just kind of on the timeline? Do you think it's larger than the word Gaslamp fantasy suggests?
I think so, because Gaslamp really refers to the Edwardian period, which is post-Victorian. And that's early 1900s, when instead of electricity, you had gas lamps. And so that would be the end of the Victorian, the early Edwardian period, which is Downton Abbey. If anybody needs a reference, there is Downton Abbey. Victorian was prior to that, and Regency was prior to that. I think Gaslamp encompasses everything from the late 1700s up through the Edwardian period, which is the 1920s, 30s, maybe.
Sure. Would you say like maybe even up to kind of that end of the First World War?
I think that may be pushing out of that, because the technology is getting kind of modern at that time. But then again, on the other hand, I don't know where else to stick something written in that period.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like its own insular, decade, basically. If it's like the war decade, pre, middle, and post. But okay, so you'd say kind of the end of the 1700s all the way kind of up to that period, which is a huge time of upheaval when it comes to industry and technology.
And culture.
Yeah.
Culture everywhere. was changing dramatically. The Regency era, people kind of lump in with the Victorian era, and it's completely different. The social expectations, everybody kind of sees the Victorian era as being very tight-laced. The Regency was not.
Oh, interesting.
It really was not. And so that was very different. And then, the post-Victorian era was also very different. Women's rights, just as one example.
Yeah.
And the emancipation of slaves. I mean, there's just so much social change encompassed. And one thing that's really interesting, Gaslamp fantasies take very different approaches to handling that. And that's one of the things I love about the genre, because there's so much flexibility. There are ones that are written deep, really in Victorian England, innate magic, and I didn't make a note of the author, but that's one of the newer ones recently. That's very much Victorian and late Victorian, which has a very different character than His Majesty's Dragon, which is about a dragon air force flying against Napoleon.
Yeah, great series.
Brilliant. But it's a totally different character and feel, even though it's in the same genre. And you get a huge variety of, you've got, some that are, like what I write, are His Majesty's Dragons, mythical creatures.
Yeah.
And kind of limited to that. And then you have some that are very much entrenched in the magical aspect, innate magic, vine witch, paper magician. I love paper magician.
Oh yeah, Charlie Holmberg. I just finished that the trilogy. I haven't done Plastic Magician yet, but
yeah, I haven't finished the trilogy yet, but I love that. I love the first book, but that certainly wasn't a real life representation of a real place.
Right.
Which is another place where Gaslamp fantasy goes several directions. It can either try to stick to real geography and real places and real history, insofar as dragons fighting Napoleon is real.
Yeah, it's close. It's close.
Yeah. Or it can create a completely different world with that level of technology and culture.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's another brand, which really, my husband calls it historical urban fantasy.
Oh yeah.
Because Manners and Monsters was one example. It's a zombie book.
Yeah.
The Regency era zombie book. Which, I mean, what else can you call it but just plain fun?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, right. Like the Pride and Prejudice and zombies kind of thing. That it's just like it's a foray to just opening up that imagination, just saying a big what if and going
what's
nuts.
Really funny, as you mentioned, Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies. I love the movie. I had a hard time getting into the book, but I love the movie because I was watching, and you know how when you're a writer, the world always looks like half a bubble off level. You're always looking at things kind of differently than everybody else is.
Yeah.
And so I'm watching this movie, and I think actually we might have seen it in the theater, and I was just rolling, laughing, because it was just hysterical. And I suddenly had this aha of how to make my dragon plot work against the original Austen plot.
Oh, great.
And so that was the aha moment, was like, I know how it works now, because I've been cooking this plot for a while and I just hadn't put all the pieces together of how does this make sense. And something slipped into place while I was watching that. It's like, I got it. So I've got this very warm, fuzzy feeling towards that movie.
That movie, it's got a little cream on top for you. Oh, that's great.
Well, that, and it was really fun to watch Elizabeth Bennet and her sisters be a force to be reckoned with.
Right. Yeah, which
although
they are.
I still can tell you, trying to spar in a skirt. I have a black belt that I earned with my kids.
Oh, cool.
When they were little, and sparring in a skirt doesn't work that way. We'll just say
these were modified skirts from the costume department for sure,
and very well choreographed scenes.
Yeah. Oh,
but the proposal scene in there where Elizabeth basically attacks Darcy. I was speaking my son's high school English class about Pride and Prejudice, and then they didn't get enough in the lecture, so they all came over to my house to watch the movie.
Oh,
And
fun.
we got to that point and I paused it and I said, hold on a minute, guys, you need to see this. And so I showed them the proposal scene in Zombies because that was accurate to all the emotions going on in this very stained text.
And that is, I mean, this is, if anything, you must be an expert on this, where you're reading the Jane Austen text and picking up on the real subtext, which is, I think, where, of course, Jane Austen lives with her books. It's just everything is below the surface. And if you can't appreciate that, you have a hard time understanding why everyone loves them so much. But okay, so for people then who want to get into the genre, maybe they haven't, or maybe they've just kind of dabbled. What is do you got a little list? I think I've asked you to prepare of your kind of must reads for Gaslamp fantasy.
Well, some of the ones I mentioned, His Majesty's Dragon, I think is a great place to start.
Yeah.
Paper Magician is brilliant. Manners and Monsters is kind of silly, but it's fun. Vine Witch, which is set in France. And the witchcraft is about vineyards and winemaking.
I have to say, the cover
Totally
for
different.
Vine Witch is so gorgeous.
Oh, it is gorgeous.
It is
I
so
just
beautiful.
drooled. Yes.
The envy that just sprouted in me when I saw that
I got
cover.
that book
I'm like,
because of the
"Oh."
cover. Okay.
Yeah.
I hate to admit it, but I bought the book because of the cover.
Yeah.
But it's beautifully evocative of a time and a place that's not familiar. And that one is beautiful. Mermaid's Sister is a different take on Gaslamp in that it has a very fairy tale quality to it. That is, it's the same era of technology and history, more or less, but it has a very fairy tale like feel.
Sure.
So that's another one that I've really enjoyed.
Okay. I was going to write this
Innate
down, but I guess
Magic.
I have this recorded, so I haven't done Mermaid Sister yet.
Innate Magic that I mentioned before is a Victorian era. And they're talking about magicians who the main character can imbue magic into cloth, and he's a tailor.
Oh, cool. I love seeing that intersection of I mean, kind of like what we were mentioning before. It's like the technology, but even just the realities of the lifestyle, and then just in putting in a tiny bit of magic to just see how can that. Paper Magician is another great example of that, where just this idea of, wow, origami could yield magical outcomes.
I thought that was
so creative.
Brilliant. I thought it was such a brilliant take. I've never seen that approach. Yeah. And I loved it for that.
That was very, very fun.
Oh, there was one other that is totally different, which I pulled out because it really shows some of the breadth of the genre. It's called Beneath the Canyons. And it is set in the Old West. A mage who's trying to stop rogue magicians. Okay,
cool. So it's like an old Western, I mean, which is the same time period kind of, but it's, you don't look at it. It's, I'm actually in the middle of reading Veins of Gold by Charlie Holmberg, who did the Paper Magician books. Yeah. And it's a similar thing. It's like, it's not exactly Wild West, but it's kind of the beginning of the California gold rush in San Francisco and stuff. And it's like, man, what a fresh take to go a place we don't usually go.
And I think that's what Gaslamp does best, is that it takes fantasy to places where we haven't seen it be before. Because traditional fantasy, and don't get me wrong, I love Tolkien and all the epic fantasies that we have. They're beautiful, they're amazing. But it became very ingrained in the fantasy genre that it was going to be medieval, and fantasy was very much equated with medieval.
Yeah.
And to see it going places into regions of history where we haven't seen it before, and taking on plots other than, and again, I love the epic fantasy plot, the hero's journey and all of that.
Yeah.
But it is fun to see it going places and doing things that, exploring plots that fantasy really hasn't gone before, even though other genres have, fantasy mysteries. I love those.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was sitting through a whole presentation once about how the success of Harry Potter could really be attributed to the fact that it is a mystery format dressed up in a fantasy, then kind of toned for young adult. And it's like, that is so brilliant when you think about it. And you start kind
Yeah.
of playing with those genres a little bit.
Mhm.
You just gave me an idea about how I would love to see kind of the epic fantasy storyline, but like you said, instead of couching it in the medieval time period, you couch it in like a Gaslamp fantasy setting,
Mhm.
but you follow what feels very much like an epic fantasy. I wonder how that would go.
Yeah.
But anyway, these are the what if questions that are bound to
Mhm.
happen when people
But
like
that's where
us
the best
get
ideas
together.
come from.
Yeah.
When you just let yourself go into the what ifs and explore.
Yeah. No, I love that. Any last hits for people? We've talked about the free books available. Is free book available to get into your Jane Austen series, as well as the other entry points there? Anywhere else people should be connecting with you if they want to learn more about you or get into
Oh,
your writing?
absolutely. My website is randombitsofascination.com. And I've got a combination of, well, it's called Random Bits for a reason. But I've got a lot of bits of Regency history and era history that help explain some of the details that might be glossed over in the books. I also have a whole series on the dragon mythology from Britain that inspired a lot of what happens and the characters in the book. The main character is actually inspired by the myth of the Mortifor dragon. And so I have a number of those myths talked about in the website, just to kind of give some background history on, dragons in England makes more sense than you would imagine, because they're everywhere. You can't shake a stick at them. I also have a Facebook group, Friends of the Blue Order, because the Blue Order dragons on Facebook, and I'm on there as well.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah, we'll drop some links again in the description so people can easily navigate over to those. But it's been an absolute pleasure, Maria Grace. You'll have to let me know when your next book comes out or something, and we can maybe sit down and talk about it, because
I would love to do that.
This has been a lot of fun. And I know if I don't cut
enjoyed it.
myself off, we'll go for 90 minutes plus just talking about
I
this
know
type
the
of
feeling.
stuff. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Well, thanks so much.
Okay.
We'll
Thank
see you soon.
so much. Thanks.
Again, thanks for joining us. That was Maria Grace. She is a historical fantasy author with a ton of books out there. If you go onto Amazon and start perusing the historical fantasy charts, you'll see her books everywhere. But check out the link below in the description if you want to give her stuff a shot for free. And I hope that you'll check her out, because I think her stuff is really, really great. And she's a very creative mind and doing some wonderful things for the genre. Anyway, that's it for me today. I'm going to go and work on my book, as I always do. Take care.